Nowadays, pig keeping has changed a bit from what it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. This is particularly so in the case of sows. Farmers nowadays are moving a bit towards bigger sow herds. 5 and 10 and even 20 and 100 sow herds are quite common. And with this increase in size, the pattern of sow keeping has changed. People are keeping sows indoors all the time. And with this, feed has become more important. For instance, grass is not available to a lot of sows at all nowadays. Dairy byproducts are becoming increasingly scarce. And for that reason, we have to pay a lot more attention to the feeding of the in-pig sow. Now, feeding is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, feed is costly. Secondly, there is plenty of evidence that if sows are overfed, you get very poor results. And thirdly, as I will show you from our experiments, underfeeding can also lead to poor results. For this reason, we have carried out some experiments here dealing with the feeding of in-pig sows. And in this first experiment, which I will describe, we compared several different levels of feed. One group of sows, 20 sows, carried on for 3 pregnancies and lactations, got 6 pounds of feed per day when they were in pig. Now this we will call our control treatment. Now a second group of sows got a variation of this in that they were fed higher during the first month, 8 pounds a day, and higher during the last month, a further 8. And then during the middle months they got 4 pounds per day. Now you will see that this is exactly the same total amount of feed as the first group of sows got. The third group got half that total amount of feed, 3 pounds per day, while a fourth group got 1 pound per day plus grazing. This experiment went on, as I said, for 3 litters. Now when they were suckling, all sows got exactly the same amount of feed. Now from this experiment we have 2 important results. Firstly, we get no effect on the number of pigs born. You can see the numbers across there, they vary very little, the lowest being just over 10 to the highest 10.5. Now this difference we would estimate is a chance difference, and so we say that feed, whether the amount of feed or the pattern of feeding, has no effect whatsoever on the number of pigs born. On the other hand, the pattern of feeding, or the amount of feed, certainly affected the birth weight of the pigs. And on the bottom line here you can see that the sows getting the low levels, 3 pounds per day or 1 pound plus grass, had lighter pigs. Now lighter pigs are harder to rear, and they will also be lighter at weaning. So to summarize this experiment then, the 2 main results are that the way you feed your in-pig sows will not affect the number of pigs born, but it will affect the birth weights, it'll also affect the weaning weights and the number of pigs at weaning. Now, this experiment did not, of course, tell us exactly how much feed we should give a sow. We knew that 3 pounds per day is too small, but we don't know exactly what the right level is. So we started a second experiment. Knowing that 3 was too small, we decided to try 4.5. And in this second experiment, we have compared 3 pounds per day with 6 pounds per day with 4.5 pounds per day. Now this experiment has, so far, we have the results of the first litters. Some of the sows have produced second and third litters, and the indications are that results won't change very much from those we've got in the first litters. Now here we see that where we get that on both levels of feed, 6 pounds per day or 4.4, which is almost 4.5, we get the same number of pigs born, and we get no difference at all in birth weight. So we can conclude from this that 4.5 pounds per day is enough for an in-pig sow, provided she is well fed when she's suckling. Now there is one further reservation. This result applies to a very high standard of housing where the sows have good bedding and are not allowed out. Now say for instance, if we have a sow that's out in a cold paddock or a cold muddy paddock during the winter, then we can be quite sure that under these circumstances 4.5 pounds per day will not be enough, and indeed it may take 6 or 7 pounds per day under poor housing and poor management to keep a sow right. But if the housing is good, and we must recommend good housing, then 4.5 pounds per day is an adequate amount of feed for an in-pig sow. Of course, having fed your sow properly during the in-pig period, you also have to manage her well while she's suckling the litter in order to get best results. Now, one of the things which I regard as very important is that when a sow is being brought into farrow, she should be washed down so that she goes into a clean farrowing pen in a nice clean condition. And this will help enormously to keep down, say, the incidence of scours afterwards. There are a few other important things while the sow is suckling. For instance, the little pigs must be treated to prevent anemia. Now, this can be done by either an injection or by oral treatment, but in any event it must be done. The injection should be carried out at 3 days of age if you choose to do that, or oral treatment must be started at 3 days and repeated at 10 days of age and 17 days of age. Now, to get best litter weights, the pigs must also get creep feed. Even the best milking sow can only get her pigs to about 25 pounds at 8 weeks of age. So that you must start creep feeding at about 10 days of age. Put in a palatable creep feed at 10 days. If you do this and you get the pigs to eat creep feed, there's no reason why you can't have your pigs at 20 to 25 pounds weight at 5 weeks of age. And if you have them at that weight, then you can wean at 5 weeks of age. And this means your sow can produce another litter quicker. It means that the number of pigs per sow per annum is greater, and the profit from the whole enterprise increases accordingly. Well, now that we have brought the pig as far as the weaning stage, the next thing to do is to get this pig to bacon weight, and so we change our subject slightly and go on to fattening pigs. There's one important thing that we must remember firstly, and that is that unless the pig which we now start to fatten is a properly bred pig, by this I mean that it has the ability to produce lean bacon in the end, then nothing we can do will ever produce a good pig. Unless it has the potential to be a good pig at the start, we're largely wasting our time. So that although I'm not going to talk very much on breeding, it's one of the important things which every pig producer must have in his mind all the time. Now, breeding, say, the first point, and secondly comes feeding. I think by now everyone knows that feed represents about 80% of the cost of fattening a pig. And for this reason, if feeding is not done in the best way, then we can very easily lose money on pig fattening rather than making a profit. The quality of the feed is very important. And how do we measure this? Well, in the final analysis, we measure it by the amount of feed that it takes to put on a pound of weight on a pig. This is called the feed conversion efficiency, and a good figure is 3.5. So that if we can achieve a pound of live weight gain in a pig for 3.5 pounds of feed, then we're fairly successful. The ingredients that go to make up the ration will affect this feed conversion efficiency. For instance, some ingredients are what we call low energy, like, say, bran and pollards are low energy, and others, like barley and milo maize, are high energy feeds. So that normally speaking, it's better to use the high energy feeds, unless, of course, that the low energy ones are very cheap altogether, in which case, although we will get a poorer feed efficiency, it may be cheaper to do so. But normally speaking, this does not happen. Now, another factor which influences the feed conversion efficiency, or in other words, say, the feed cost of producing a pig, is the protein in the ration. Quality of protein is something which we hear a lot about recently, and it's very important. But if we assume good quality proteins, such as fish meal and soybean meal, then the amount of this good quality protein will also affect the cost of producing a pig. And it will, as well as that, it will affect the amount of lean meat in the pig. Now, in this first chart here, we have an example here from an experiment carried out at Moorepark, where we fed 2 levels of protein. One was a high level, which, say, about 17% in the weaner ration, dropping to about 15 in the fattener ration, and the low one was about 2% lower. So, in other words, about 15 dropping to 13 or so. Now, when we fed these 2 rations, they were the same other than protein. When we fed them to groups of pigs, we find that on the high protein ration, we get a better feed efficiency. You can see the figure there, 3.47 instead of 3.67. And as well as that, we get thinner back fat at all stages. The figures here are in millimeters: shoulder fat, thinner; mid-back fat, thinner; and loin fat, thinner. In other words, on the high protein ration, we get better grading pigs and less feed to produce a pig to bacon weight. Now, weighing of feed is one important thing which an awful lot of people neglect. And yet it's very important. Most of your money goes into feed, and some people don't know how much feed they're giving their pigs. Now, we talk a lot about planes of feeding in this respect. And plane of feed means how much do you give your pigs. Now, just to give you some examples of planes of feed, say a high and a low plane of feed. These are ones which we feed here. If we take the high plane of feed here, you can just see here that you get about 2 1/3 pounds to a 40-pound pig, increasing to nearly 7 pounds for a 200 pounds pig. That's a high plane of feed. Whereas a low one will start at about 2 pounds per day, increasing to about 6. Now, plane of feed has an effect. For instance, if you feed your pigs too highly, you're going to get fatter pigs. If you feed them too little feed, they're going to be very slow growing, and they may in fact have poorer feed efficiency and consequently less profit. So it is important to pick a plane of feed that suits the type of pig you have. Of course, the better the pig, the higher you can feed him and still have good grading. Now, other points of importance in management is the way you feed the pigs, whether you feed them on the floor or whether you feed them in a trough. Now, there's a lot of controversy about floor and trough feeding. Floor feeding has some advantages in that it may allow you to put more pigs into a pen. But of course, if it's done wrongly, then it has no advantage at all. You can get a lot of wastage with floor feeding carried out in the wrong way. Some people have a habit of throwing the feed at the pigs rather than putting it on the floor. And this, of course, will lead to wastage. It may also lead to fighting and tail biting and generally poor performance. Now, the weight at which you slaughter your pigs is another important management point. Here are some results from an experiment carried out at Moorepark, where we slaughtered at 180 pounds and 210 pounds. Now, these are within the grading range at the moment. You find, generally speaking, that where you slaughter at a lighter weight, your back fat is thinner. You can see it here for shoulder fat, mid-back fat, and loin fat. And your food conversion efficiency is better too. The only point at which you lose is the length of the pig. But even at 180 pounds here, our pigs were reasonably long. So if you have a good pig, you can slaughter at a lighter weight, get better back fat and better grading, and better feed efficiency into the bargain. But there's one important point in this slaughter weight, and it is that even a 10 or a 15 pounds difference can have a big effect on the pig at the factory. And unless you have a scales, you cannot judge the weight of your pig. We turn out about 1,000 pigs a year, and no one here is prepared to say they can guess the weight of a pig. So without a scales, you can't be correct here, and yet this 10 pounds may make all the difference between a pig grading A and a pig grading B. Housing is the fourth point in fattening pig production which we want to talk about. And I purposely rate it fourth because no matter how good the house is, unless the feeding and management are also up to a high standard, the enterprise will not be successful. Now, housing is a very controversial aspect of pig production. Many people feel very strongly about it. And for that reason, we have carried out an experiment here at Moorepark in which we compared 3 houses. Now, there are, of course, probably a dozen different types of house available to people, but we picked 3 which I think represent the extremes in the range of pig houses that are available. Now, taking them in order, first, the Solari house is a kennel type house. It's moderate in terms of cost, and it's quite a useful house in many ways. There are, however, some disadvantages with it. Because it's a kennel house with a low roof, it's not so easy to see your pigs. It's more difficult still to, say, weigh pigs in it or to treat a sick pig. We have also found, over a few years using this house, that the temperature in it tends to be more variable. Now, the second house which we have here at Moorepark is the Jordan house. This is a controversial house. It's sometimes known as the sweat house. It's a very simple house and quite cheap to construct. Basically, it's just a type of pen, loose pen, with 3 solid walls and a front in which we have a window and a door. The dunging passage is not differentiated in it, and floor feeding is practiced in our setup, although more recent Jordans have incorporated trough feeding. Now, the third house we have here is the most expensive. It's a Scandinavian type house. It has a large area per pig, central feeding passage, side dunging passages, timber pen divisions as in Scandinavian countries, and a trough. This is the house in which we get our best performance in terms of feed efficiency. It's probably the easiest house to manage, insofar as you have slats in the dunging passage which eliminate a lot of the cleaning out. But we have found that you get more respiratory diseases in this house than in either the Solari or the Jordan. This is probably due to the fact that all pigs in this house are in respiratory contact. They're all in the same atmosphere, and it's easier to transmit respiratory diseases from one pig to another under these circumstances. As well as looking at, say, the management problems inherent in these three houses, we have in actual fact compared the performance of pigs in them. In an experiment that lasted nearly 3 years, and during which we had about 1,400 pigs put through the three houses, we standardized feed and standardized management, and then compared pigs in the three. On this chart we have the results of this experiment. Overall, we find that the Danish house, having 3.41, had the best feed conversion efficiency. This, as I said earlier, again means that it took 3.41 pounds of feed to put on a pound of gain on a pig in the Danish house. The Jordan house was somewhat poorer at 3.56, while the Solari was just a fraction poorer still at 3.6. It is, however, important, I think, to realize that these conversions, although there's a difference from one house to another, overall they are quite good. And in actual fact, the 3.6 in our Solari is much better than the national average, which we expect is somewhere around 3.8 to 4. Grading was quite good in all three houses. You can see the Jordan being slightly superior than the other two. Now, in terms of cost per pig, the Jordan house was the cheapest at £6.10 per pig, while the Danish was the most expensive at £19.10 per pig. So that in assessing the three houses, we have to look at a couple of factors and try and balance one up against the other. The better feed efficiency in the Danish house has to be balanced against the lower housing cost in the Jordan, and the slightly better feed conversion or the slightly better grading also in the Jordan house. And when Dr. Atwood put economic data figures on this information, he found that in actual fact the profit per pig was somewhat better in the Jordan than in the other two houses. However, I think the important point about this whole comparison is that the differences we obtained between houses were quite small, and that in actual fact they were far less than differences which it's easy to find when you compare good and bad management or good and bad rations. So looking at it from an overall point of view, the in-pig sow will perform at her best on a level of feed about 4.5 pounds per day, provided she is adequately housed. During the suckling period, management is very important. For instance, sows should be washed when being brought into farrow, so that the sow is clean when going into a farrowing pen that has been thoroughly cleaned and disinfected. As well as that, the young pigs must be cared for. They must be treated to prevent anemia at 3 days of age. Creep feeding is very important. Even the best sow can't get her pigs to a suitable weaning weight without the litter getting creep feed. So that creep feed must be introduced, a palatable creep feed must be introduced at about 10 days of age. If this is done, we can expect to get pigs to about 20 to 25 pounds at 5 weeks of age, and at this stage they're suitable for weaning. Going on to the fattening stage, the ration is critical. A high quality ration must be used. Present day evidence indicates that a higher level of protein is now justified than was recommended a few years ago. This gives better carcass quality and better feed efficiency. Management must be of a high standard at all stages during fattening. Feed must be weighed out if the pigs are to get the right amount and if there's to be no wastage. Pigs must be weighed before sending to slaughter, otherwise we can't be sure that the carcass will be of the right weight. And finally, the house must be of a high quality house. It doesn't appear to be particularly important whether it's a Jordan house or a Danish house or a Solari house. But the housing cost must be kept as low as possible, while at the same time ensuring that we have a good standard of building, that the house is easily managed, and that it is structurally sound. Given these important points, pig production can be a successful enterprise and can add considerably to the profit on a farm.